Right. Hello, everyone. Good evening. So just to have a couple of housekeeping notes. For the webinar today, the audience members' microphones and cameras will be off and will remain so throughout. And please note that this event is being recorded, and you're all welcome to use the Q&A function throughout the event to put questions to our panel. And you don't have to wait until the Q&A section of the event. The chat and raise hand functions are currently disabled. So today's webinar, Breaking Bread, What's Wrong with Wheat, is a webinar organized by Cambridge Global Food Security. It is part of the series of Food for Thought panel events. And please check the Global Food Security website for all our past events. Okay, to start our discussion today, I'll let you introduce the topic. So bread has been consumed by humans for thousands of years and has always played a major role throughout history and across different countries and cultures. For years, it was the simple product of flour, yeast, and water. But in the past 60 or so years, both flour and bread have gone through such methods of ultra processing that has led to make people intolerant or allergic to it. And with the climate changing drastically in many parts of the world, wheat is no longer a viable crop. Should we reclaim bread as it was and diversify at the same time to bring resilience and more nutrition to people's diets? This event will consider the history, economic, health, and environmental impact of this staple food, thanks to our panel of experts today. So I'm Nadia Radzman. I'm a plant biologist from the Sainsbury Lab at Cambridge University, and I'm interested in improving the food system through reutilization of forgotten crops. And today, for our panelists, I first would like to introduce Professor Martin Jones. He is an Emeritus George Pitt-Rivers Professor of Archaeological Science, University of Cambridge. Martin works on archaeobotany and archaeogenetics in the context of the broader archaeology of food. His current research interests include the spread of farming across Asia, food sharing in the Upper Paleolithic, and the development of agrarian societies and their food economies in later prehistory and historic periods. The second panelist is Dr. Phil Howell, who is the head of breeding in NIAB. Since joining NIAB from the commercial sector in 2007, Phil has worked on breeding and pre-breeding projects, including NIAB's flagship wheat resynthesis program, a multi-partner wheat pre-breeding initiatives, and the development of wheat magic populations. Phil is now leading and managing NIAB's portfolio of breeding and pre-breeding work across a range of broad-acre arable crops, including cereals, legumes, specialty oilseeds, and others. This is often collaborative work with industry partners from breeding companies, end users, and other parts of the supply chain. Phil's input forms a significant part of NIAB's work to raise the profile of domestic plant protein production through legume crops and other protein sources. Our third panelist is Professor Shailaja Fennell. She is a professor of regional transformation and economic security in the Department of Land Economy, University of Cambridge. Shailaja's research interests include institutional reform and collective action, food production and rural development, gender norms and gender gaps in development interventions, and provision of public goods and the role of partnerships. She has been a lead investigator or co-investigator on several multi-million-pound research projects funded by UKRI, ASEAN, UGC, UKI, ERI, and DFID. She was also a consultant on inequality and rural development with Oxfam, an evidence-based policy with the World Bank, and was the social science expert on agriculture and gender, and an author of the European Report on Development on Fragility in Africa, 2008-2009. Last of our panelists is Dr. Alexa Bellows. She is the Research Fellow of Co-Health Benefits of Sustainable Food System, University of Edinburgh. Alexa is a nutritional epidemiologist whose research focuses on improving food systems to be healthier and more sustainable. She is interested in developing metrics for diets and food systems to facilitate policy change. In 2022, she was awarded an Imana postdoctoral research fellowship to develop a metric to measure sustainability of food environments and will be piloting the metric in India and Scotland, right? So to start, so we would start our discussion by allowing the panel to answer the question, what is wrong with wheat? And I would like to start with Martin.
Right, thank you, Nadia. Now, at the moment, over half the energy in the human food chain comes from 4 plants, and one of those plants is bread wheat. And it's very efficient at doing one particular thing. It's very efficient at creating a very large number of calories from a particular area of ground, and it served us extremely well in that process. And in a commercial monetary world, that has proven effective. If we look in history at how long that kind of humans been feeding in that way, it's a history of about 1,500 years. It's about 1,500 years that the world has shrunk down onto a small number of very high-yielding plants and worked in that way, which is quite interesting to me as an archaeologist, because the actual plant bread wheat is about 9,000 years old, and agriculture is about 12,000 years old. So for a long time, when bread wheat was around, it didn't have that. It wasn't dealt with in the same way. And of course, we don't want to go back to a past that's no longer relevant, but we also want to be aware of what the needs and possibilities of today's world are, which is different from the world in which these 4 plants became dominant. And I think for a number of reasons, we don't need just to look at the big crops that we've been looking at in what for me as an archaeologist is recent history.
Thanks, Martin. That was really succinct and surprising how we look at like the different successions of the events historically. I'd like to now turn to Phil. Oh, you're on mute.
Novice mistake. I've been breeding wheat for 25 years. I've been baking bread for over 20 years. So this topic is obviously dear to my heart. And I don't think fundamentally there is that much wrong with wheat. We know about this much maligned Chorleywood bread process, this industrial bread process, which was devised in 1961. And really it was a response to post-war austerity. It allowed cheap food. It allowed a reduction in imports, so the UK became much more self-sufficient. And I guess we as society are probably guilty of trying to make wheat all things to all people. And it's become a victim of its own success. Here at NIAB, we're just up the road from the university. We do a lot of work trying to increase its genetic diversity and stop the gene pool from becoming stagnant, if you like. We've had large projects in this pre-breeding space to do that. But having said that, we need to be much more open to growing and processing a whole range of different grains. So just thinking about the UK, 75% of our arable area is occupied by just 3 crops: wheat, barley, and oilseed rape, and that's clearly unsustainable for a whole range of reasons. And we were asked by DEFRA to carry out a review of underutilized crops, and we're very much interested in diversifying both food systems and agricultural systems in support of that. And of course, if we do change that, it will have ramifications to both our food and our farming systems. More than half of the wheat we grow in the UK, and I'm sorry, it's a global food security meeting, but I'm speaking from a UK perspective. Over half the wheat we grow in the UK is destined for animal feed. And if demographic changes continue for a host of good reasons, we will be consuming less animals in the future. Therefore, we may need to grow less wheat, and the wheat that we do grow will be targeted more on food than feed. So that's a mind shift. And of course, wheat is a very hungry crop in terms of energy production. So most of the carbon footprint that's associated with a loaf of bread doesn't come from switching the oven off. It comes from manufacturing the nitrogen fertilizer that's used to increase productivity and increase the protein content of the grain. So we kind of need to wean ourselves off our addiction to nitrogen fertilizer in the future to have sustainable food systems. And the industry is keen to support that. So the NFU have a bold target of net zero emissions across the agricultural sector by 2040. I've been asked to join a panel down there in a couple of weeks to discuss how we can maintain current bread making performance with lower levels of nitrogen, and there probably won't be any easy answers to that. But at the moment, we need grain nitrogen to be at 13%, grain protein to be at 13% or higher to be sure of getting good performance through current industrial bread making processes. So something needs to change to reduce our nitrogen requirement to do that. So in a nutshell, I don't think there are any simple answers. Wheat can be a fine food and a fine crop, but we shouldn't make it the only one.
Thanks, Phil. I'd like to now open it to Shailaja.
Thank you, Nadia. So it's not what is wrong with wheat. I think it's what human beings are doing with wheat that is the problem. So let's not, the non-human is not at fault. It's us. I think another fact that we'd like to think about is the lack of diversity in terms of our cereal intake. And that is actually just 30 years old. So at the moment, up to 80% of the typical cereal consumption that we have globally, it's an average, of course, it will vary, but an average in terms of global markets is between rice, wheat, and maize, with wheat, rice, and maize in that order. So the problem with wheat is also a problem for rice in terms of what we're consuming, or maize. It's the fact that we eat super refined products. I'll leave more of that to Alexa because it's her area of expertise. But what does this mean? It means that the nature of the food markets we have is part of the problem. There's a whole futures market in food, in these crops. All those who produce for the global market, the supply chains want to ensure this. They would prefer uniformity, homogeneity, which means you go for a single variety. It tastes the same. It's a bit boring. And that is bad for us, both in terms of what we eat is not what we need in terms of nutrition. And so what we're ending up with, as Martin said, is we have a supercharged carbohydrate intake, which is actually bad for us because it is the onset of adult diabetes. So the work I do and the areas that we work in Africa, in as well as South and Southeast Asia, there are numerous other cereals that are eaten, and it might just be quite useful to do a global shift and try and understand. So the work that we did in Tigris was all around some of the more forgotten crops or underutilized millets. They were the majority crop, and of course Martin has done work historically on that. So it's a very particular moment where we're looking at what is wrong with wheat. I think what we need to understand is our food systems approach is fundamentally broken, and we need to reconsider that. The third point I want to make in terms of the stories, it's how we consume wheat, not just what we do. The story of eating cereals is far better for the human gut if we talk about fermented foods. They break it down in terms of particularly the ability to absorb iron. That's an issue. And there's a particular rise, of course, in terms of gut diseases. And that's interesting to me because it says, well, what's happening? The economic models are pushing us in one direction. The human body, the mouth is going much faster than the stomach, and the stomach is not able to absorb these things. So in addition to us generating human-made diseases like diabetes from our lifestyle, we're also creating a huge number of new allergens, which are increasing because of the way in which we're eating. And some of this has to do with where we put wheat. Why are we putting it into thickeners for babies? We shouldn't be having it before the age of 1. Wheat creates, a lot of that generation. And I say this because I'm Tamil, I'm a rice-basing community. We don't eat wheat till we go to school, It's not commonplace. So there are three different economic reasons there. Thank you, Nadia.
Thanks, Shailaja. And I think that, fits in really well with the expertise of Alexa, especially on, the different allergens and complexities, health complexities. Yep.
I think I'm next. So from a nutritional standpoint, for the majority of people, there's nothing wrong with consuming wheat. I think this echoes a bit of what the other panelists have said. But as a nutritional epidemiologist, I think one of the biggest issues with wheat is the way in which we consume it. The majority of wheat that we consume is refined, where the germ and the bran have been stripped away. And these are the components of the plant that have the majority of fiber and vitamins and minerals, which would make wheat a significantly healthier crop for us to be consuming. The whole grain consumption has been associated with the decreased risk of many chronic diseases such as diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and certain cancers. But in the UK, for example, whole grain intake is not achieved by the majority of adults and children, or the recommended intake of whole grains is not achieved by adults and children. There is a small but growing prevalence of people who suffer from celiac disease and gluten intolerance, where consuming gluten, a component of wheat and other grains, is not recommended. And I know for celiac disease, there is a significant genetic component, but for those with gluten intolerance, there's been some evidence that the ultra processing of bread and the industrial process that we use to create bread have exacerbated these symptoms, and slow fermentation and more artisanal bread could actually help relieve some of these symptoms for people who suffer from gluten intolerance. And and also for slow fermentation, in that process, it helps make some nutrients and minerals more bioavailable to the consumer. So, for example, if you're eating a whole grain bread, if there's slow fermentation, you have more bioavailable minerals from the germ and the bran. And so analysts have said diversity is all better when we think about our diets. So I'm not going to say there's anything wrong with consuming wheat, but consuming it in a whole grain way. But I do think that just generally we can, if we diversify our diets, it'll be better for our health.
Thank you, Alexa. I think there are a couple of common themes that we've discussed, which is one of it is diversification of the crops that we have. So now we are opening the Q&A session. If the audience has, or any audience members that have questions, please ask away through the Q&A box. If not, I have one question about wheat breeding, pretty much. And so now we know that, okay, we need to diversify our food with a lot of other grains. But we, as Phil had already mentioned, that had been an ongoing wheat breeding programs. So should we breed our current wheat to be the better version of wheat? Or should we actually also have a dedicated breeding program for all these neglected, underutilized cereals too at the same time? Or yeah, how do you see it?
Can I be greedy and say we should have both? Crops don't stand still, so there's a constant need to improve crops, to make them more climate resilient, to keep pace with diseases. Diseases are constantly evolving, pests and diseases, to overcome the resistance that may be there genetically. We're all keen to reduce pesticide inputs and fertilizer inputs as much as possible. So it's more incumbent on the varieties that breeders produce to do more of the heavy lifting. We've become too reliant on chemistry doing some of the work. that biology should be doing. And we need to look after our soils. Soils are a really precious resource. So we need to find ways to make wheat better genetically, and also to grow it in a manner that's kinder to the soil, to the environment, to everything around it. And that's true of all of these other crops. So an embarrassingly high proportion of the research budget that goes on crops, again from my UK perspective, goes on wheat. So there should be some fairly low-hanging fruit in terms of the other crops then catching up in terms of productivity and nutritional traits and this sort of thing. So yes, we still need to keep improving wheat, but we also need to invest in these other things. So I mentioned we were asked by DEFRA to run a review of underutilized crops, and we tried to think of all the different perspectives in which you could weight these crops. So we looked at environmental impact. We looked at do you need to invest in special equipment to grow these crops, or can you use adapting equipment, this sort of thing. And the winners in terms of grains were things like rye and triticale, which can do well in much lower input situations and on much more marginal soils. We may see a situation due to climate change where we grow grain maize instead of grain feed wheat for animal feed, or we actually grow durum wheat in the UK instead of bread wheat, and then we don't have to import durum for pasta. A crop which I'm sure Martin can comment on will be naked barley. We used to eat a lot of barley in our past, and in some parts of the world we still do. It's a very healthy grain. It delivers minerals, delivers soluble fiber. And then the alternatives, so things like buckwheat, I know some food companies are looking at. It's gluten-free, but it can do some of the things that gluten does in your thickeners that babies shouldn't have before they're one, for example. Quinoa, fava bean, chickpea. We just need to be much more open to using different things, but we need to improve those and make them in a way that it's possible to grow them well and get good yields and sustainable yields.
Could I pick up on that, Nadia, if I may, and pick Phil's brain a bit on this, because I've had the privilege of working with NIAB geneticists for a quarter of a century or so, and what I sense is the big change is when I first started working with Phil's colleagues, if I was working with something like wheat or barley, there's this fabulous set of knowledge, and we could kind of come in and hang on their coattails. For historical archaeological reasons, we happen to be interested in this millet called panicum, and at that stage, 25 years ago, our colleagues in NIAB and other places said, well, good luck to you, but if you really must do this crazy crop, and there wasn't a gene been done. I'm just conscious of how much has changed over the last 25 years. So 25 years ago, there was just a handful of crops in which we'd invested enormously in terms of genetic knowledge, and so we could go on a breeding program. And now, I mean, there are whole genomes of not of broomcorn, but of Ceteria, of foxtail millet. There's whole genomes, and the startup cost of working on a new crop is so much less that the whole game has changed. And a number of the crops that Phil just mentioned 25 years ago, there just wasn't the kind of genetic platform to get going on it. But am I right, Phil, in the game has changed dramatically, and so the question of looking at other crops apart from wheat has different answers now from
yes,
in the recent past.
Absolutely, and that's a lot of this is kind of cost driven and technology driven. So the cost of sequencing genomes has plummeted enormously since, I mean, the Human Genome Project was called the next space race almost, and the genome of wheat is 5 times bigger, and that's been done, and most crops are much simpler than wheat. So on a cost basis, it's got much cheaper. The technology has improved, but of course you don't you don't need these bells and whistles. Mankind has been breeding and selecting crops for us, for what did you say, 9,000, 12,000 years?
Yeah.
So these things can hasten crop improvement massively, but you don't need these investments in technology necessarily to start a breeding program. You just need variation, and you need the skills to be able to spot what's better than something else, and then take that on to the next generation.
And I'm guessing because of the climate change, the unpredictable weather, that it's somehow forced us to actually look for other options around too, and that's how we sort of look back to history, what we've been consumed before. To continue, we have a question from Amber Silk from Trinity College. It's addressed to Shailaja. So you mentioned that producers have an interest in us consuming a homogeneous diet. Why is this, and is this related to the cost of the production?
Thank you, Amber. Thank you, Nadia. I meant homogeneity in selling. So, for example, let me give you the example of the Cavendish banana. There are lots of varieties of bananas that exist. One was bred. It has a particular shape. It has a particular curve. And that's what the EU will allow as importing. And this has to do with prescription of products. Sometimes it's related to food safety, but sometimes it's related to stacking. Supermarkets find it easier to have uniform crops. So you have only one type of banana. Similarly, in terms of processing of other products, if you're processing wheats of different type, or you're going from wheats to millet, your processing machine will have to have different grades of rollers. You can't simply move from one to the other. And therefore, in terms of reducing the cost from the field to the consumer's plate, at every level, the economic logic is reduce the unit cost of production. So it's not a homogeneous diet so much as homogeneity of products that will then go into your supermarket basket. Thank you.
Thank you, Shailaja. And we have another question from the audience. Laura Valley asked, what are the main obstacles to ingesting more whole grains? Is it reluctance on the consumer's part, or is the industry not ready to work with whole grains? We know that that'd be beneficial to both the human health and the environment. And I think I'll address this question to Alexa, like for this whole grain versus refined wheat too, and the effects and the impacts of it. Yeah.
So I do think, as with everything, it's also very context specific. So I don't want to overgeneralize it and say these are the main barriers everywhere. But I know that some barriers from a consumer perspective is that consumers aren't used to consuming whole grains. A lot of consumers mostly have consumed refined grains their entire life. And so the taste is different, or the texture might be different. And then from a cooking perspective, it takes a lot longer to cook most whole grains. And so if you are someone who has a lot of time constraints, there has been some studies that have looked at one of the barriers would be poor experience with cooking of whole grains, and then people not wanting to buy them again. But I always hate saying that it's a consumer, it's like on the consumer that they should be consuming, or it's their fault that they're not consuming enough. I do think that the industry has a large role to play in offering whole grains at an affordable price to people. A lot of times whole grain products are more expensive than the refined products. And, this is partly due to what was just discussed about it's just cheaper for them, I think, to produce refined products. I also think you can market whole grains as these healthier options, and then they end up being for high-end consumers. And I think that we should make whole grains more accessible to everyone.
Thanks, Alexa. It's kind of strange that something that is more processed is which possibly require a lot more money and cost to do it, would be cheaper than the one that's not as processed. But then we have another question that's following the previous one. as we shift from refined wheat to whole grains, how will farmers, both those farming wheat and animals, be impacted? So I think this might be for Phil, perhaps. How would the change of, or maybe Shailaja? Yeah.
I'm happy to take it, but Phil, please do come
Yeah,
in. I mean,
but
so
yeah.
the current project we're doing with a NERC project looking at the peatlands, it's a different project, but it's the same narrative. What do farmers grow and why do they grow it? And it would equally be true in other parts of the world. So the puzzle that Alexa raised, I'd like to go there and then go forward. It is bizarre that whole grains are more expensive to produce. The argument makes no sense in terms of the logic of production. You produce, you then process, and the processing cost has to be imputed, and then we sell. The problem happens because the nature of supply chains, you want to reduce the cost. So you buy huge bulk, you buy in forward markets, you make farmers sell cheap. And they sell cheap because it's assured, not because they're being exploited, but selling cheap in large bulk gives you your returns and you want to cover your costs. Whereas batch production or artisanal production, you need lots of purchasers, and lots of purchasers is more risky because you don't know what's going to happen. So you go for a bulk sale. Now that is a problem. It is entirely possible to process all crops in their whole forms, including bananas and wheat. We just need to package differently. This doesn't mean more packaging. It used to be done in gunny sacks before. It's just returning to methods that allowed us to keep the integrity of that particular commodity. So that's the first. It is the way in which we produce, and because scale gives unit cost reduction, we just get completely channeled. It's like we have tunnel vision. We think only this way because the entire costing procedure works that way. It is expensive to break, and we'll have to think of the sunk costs of that because of one-time change. In relation to the question of what will happen, well, farmers will sell whole grains and they will package it differently, but you have to price it so that their costs are taken into account. It is not going to make a difference. In fact, it will be better in terms of whole grains being used because all the energy, and there's a huge energy in processing of all cereals. In terms of the energy use in the machines, in terms of the carbon emissions, in terms of the carbon miles of transporting these things, it would be far better to operate in whole products for across the agricultural chain, including in cereal crops. So it is not going to affect farmers in terms of their costs. In fact, it's a far more effective and efficient use of their costs. However, it will make a difference in terms of their contracting, because you will need new contractors who are willing to purchase in this way. So they will have to be shipped to the supply chain. But I will hand it over to Phil.
I'm not sure there's a huge amount I can add to that. It's all making a lot of sense. So as far as most farmers are concerned, certainly those producing the crops, what they are selling is the whole grains. It's the processor who then buys the whole grains and refines it or not, as the case may be. So so in terms of selling the commodity, and I think commodity is a very interesting word, and that's commodity is the trap that I think a lot of these crops have fallen into. So there is a great reluctance from the buyers of crops often to try different varieties, because they may have to have an enormous storage bin for one variety, and if another variety is different, an enormous storage bin from those, rather than having a mixture. And when you move from one crop to another, again, you need to keep those separate because of the way we've set up our manufacturing and processing systems. So perhaps wheat isn't the dirty word here. Perhaps commodity is the dirty word.
Thanks, Phil and Shailaja. We have another question from Andrew Forbes. Should we not keep an open mind with the increase in celiac disease onset and other gluten intolerances, that there may have been some significant changes in wheat grain composition, possibly associated with the almost universal switch to HYV dwarfed wheat? For instance, that the gluten in quality scoring system may have narrowed genetic diversity for gluten content, possibly introducing digestion problems, possibly in conjunction with ultra processing and reduced fermentation times. So I think this is the fermentation part. Alexa and Shailaja already sort of mentioned about it. I guess, yeah, all three probably. Bill, Shailaja, and Alexa. Yep.
Shall I have a go first?
Yeah.
So thank you, Andrew. And we have spoken about this before, I know. So yes, that gluten is not all glutens are equal. So we know there are some subunits within what we classify as gluten that do a particular job that's suited to some end users of wheat. So a wheat that we grow and sell as a biscuit making or cake making wheat will have a different form of gluten to what's required for bread making. It differs in its elasticity, it differs in its strength, it differs in the way the dough behaves during your baking process at home. So we have self-selected what types of gluten we want in our varieties because of the way they perform in the processing situation. So it certainly seems that some of these slower fermentation types like sourdough seem to be a lot more agnostic about the strength of the gluten. So they seem to be much more forgiving. The slower fermentation lets you get away with perhaps a different gluten type to the very strong gluten you need for the mechanical, fast Chorley wood bread process. And there may well be nutritional problems associated with that. There may well be intolerances. It's certainly my understanding that the slower fermentation allows the bacterial and the yeast natural enzymes to break down the gluten into more digestible subunits. So yes, it's possibly a factor. There are certainly lots of different gluten subunits in some of these more diverse wheats that would be worth investigating. Yeah.
Would you like me to go next?
Yeah. Shailaja.
Okay. So what I would like to make the point is that there are also older fermentation techniques. And this is, I want to bring in the matter of community knowledge and the ideas. And I think Nadia mentioned this in her earlier comments. So the IPCC in its 2021 and onwards is talking about traditional systems to be able to identify underutilized crops. But it's also about the process of eating them. And a lot of these fermentation techniques initially are to ensure the longevity of what it is that you are producing. So it's also about being waste reduction. And a lot of that is very helpful. So every part of every one of the plants, so whether it's the banana and everything, or as we said, in terms of the wheat and the hay, and, you know, at that time, the stalk would be fed to the animals and the grain would be fed to the humans. But the fermentation processes are very important because it's about micronutrients as well. So there's a connection between the fermenting and what you're eating. And here I'm talking about the economics of it and the knowledge of it in terms of recipe keeping. And I think one of the things that's really important, and, you know, you can say, oh, they're grandma's tales. They're really important because communities have heritage crops, but they also then have values for them. And the point that Phil was making about buckwheat reminded me of the Japanese system, where they will pay for the first cold pressed sesame and the first buckwheat, and it will be then also propitiated for ancestors. And those kind of slow food movements like you have in Italy, and these are the two countries not surprisingly with the longest longevity, and it has to do with how you eat and what it has to do in terms of the cultural aspect. So it is true, if we're just going for food as in calories, and the point about commodities I made earlier, I think we're missing a whole part of that human non-human natural relationship in which food is about nutrition. So eat less and eat smarter is the version that would be helpful. Thank you. Alexa, over to you.
Alexa, do you want to add?
I think everyone who's gone ahead of, oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah. I was about to comment. Do you want to add anything to the discussion on the gluten side of things? Yeah.
I think everyone has said everything I was going to say, so I don't think I have anything more to add, but I agree with everything that's been said.
Right. Thanks, Elisa, Shailaja, and Phil. I have a question for Martin, especially on the historical side of things of cereals. So how important is it wheat historically in the context of human civilization, and what are the characteristics of wheat that are responsible for its importance in human history? And are these characteristics also present in other cereal crops that, in I guess in another world, kind of could it be that another cereal can replace wheat historically at one point of time, perhaps?
Well, what I would say is the great thing about wheat, in terms of human civilization, is I think of wheat as like a loose balloon. If you can pump it with nutrients and water, you get a really big balloon, and other plants don't work like that. So, I mean, to be slightly provocative, it's the perfect plant for a capitalist world, for a market world where you want to make profit from crop production, and each of the big four is a little bit like a loose balloon. I apologize for these not very scientific analogies, and that's if productivity of calories. And I do stress calories because also, as we know, when you blow up that balloon, you blow up the starchy endosperm or something. You don't enlarge all the other goodies that are in the embryo and so forth. So you reduce the nutrient quality of them. So if what you're after is maximizing on calories per hectare, then it's an ideal thing, and that's why it's been so important in the last 1500 years, and the growth of that system. And I mean, we're within that system, and so I don't think when we look to the future, I think the two things we need to think about is, on the one, what is possible now that wasn't, as we said earlier, 25 years ago, but also what are the needs? I'm actually kind of anticipating a question that's coming up, that when we talk about global food security, are we talking about making a profit for crop production, or are we talking about feeding the hungry? And if we're talking about feeding the hungry, we've got to work out who the hungry are, where they are in the world, what options they have, and what markets or what interactions they engage with, and what plants and suit their needs best. And so I think wheat has served a particular world system well, and it may be, as we look to the future, we want to look at things in a different way. I don't know if that answers the question.
Thanks, Martin. That's interesting way to see wheat like a balloon that you just pump things and then it just produces more and more and more. But what kind of world are we actually envisioning for the future? Is it just like this stripping the environment to the point that there is no return, right? And then producing more and more, and left the other part of the world not having enough food. So I think we can go to
and I think we're working towards it. Yeah, sorry.
No, sorry, Martin. Yeah.
I was just going to say there isn't a single answer. That's why I'm not saying wheat's bad either.
Yeah.
I think we're working towards, an answer where there's many aspects to it, and different constituents and different communities have different needs and work better.
Yeah, that needs to be suited. Yeah, exactly. There's another question on the chat, on the Q&A box. In the current wheat supply, do we consider, or how can we consider, the impact of the food system, farming to milling to baking, on the nutritional value in terms of micronutrients of wheat and products? Aside from fiber, bread contributes to the micronutrient intake of the population. How can we maximize or utilize wheat as source of micronutrients? I think this could be to Alexa or Shailaja. Yep.
I can try going first. So there's the project that we've been working on with a group called Scotland the Bread, and they are growing wheat populations up here in Scotland. And they're really interested in producing the most nutritious bread possible with their wheat populations. And we had some small funding to do some testing of the nutritional components of the wheat and comparing them to other wheat types as well. And they did have some higher levels of micronutrients than the standard wheat that you would typically see in an industrial bread. So there is some evidence of that, but I think the evidence still, we don't have a lot of data on this. I think that there's a lot of people who think that we would see an increase in people consuming more micronutrients if we were consuming more diverse types of grains. And I think that would be probably very true, but I think there's still more research is needed in this area as well.
Right. So that's interesting. There is a type of wheat that actually has higher micronutrients available. The next question is, so change is required on many levels, but we need to still feed the planet. Where does the impetus for change need to come from? Government, breeders, growers, or consumers? And I think this follow-ups with the question that I asked Martin. So where would it come from? Maybe Shailaja and Phil could.
I'll try. Okay, so when we talk about food security, food sovereignty from the social sciences, these are all very different terms. For farmers who are facing risky markets, they usually want seed security, particularly in poor countries, because they want to complete the economic cycle. And so when they're moving into high-yield varieties or GMOs, they need an assurance that they will be able to purchase the seeds, which means that they will have enough money to do that. And sometimes you have, therefore, collective crop insurance schemes that allows them to buy into 3 or 5 years so that they can do that. And that works well for a farmer community that has assets. Often the mismatch is when a program is trying to be scaling up very quickly. So all farmers, be they small or big or cannot absorb risk as much as others, get put into a program, and then you will have fall away because certain groups are not as well placed. Some of it's simply scale, but it can be, as you said, Nadia, early on, in relation to climate crisis. So there are places which are more directly affected, so they have a greater cyclicality of seasonal change than before, and they should not be areas where you introduce new crops. So we have to reconsider what the new technologies are going to be able to deliver in the light of that kind of increasing instability. That's the first. The second is, the thing that's missing here is civil society. Farmers are not often brought in. One of the things that's really interesting, Robert Chambers said this in the 60s when he's now in his 90s, really, fundamental thinking and changing in development. Be it the NFU in England or farmers associations elsewhere, they don't often get a chance to talk to power. So he said the same thing about the NFU. You've got a national farmers union, but they don't come to the table when government's making policies. They come through another organization. So he wrote a book called Whose Reality Comes First. And the same narrative applies for the global south. So we're talking breeders, we're talking growers. Where are the farmers? They're the people producing the food. That needs to be part of the conversation, because it's only if they feel that they can take on board the changes. It doesn't have to be new tech. It can simply be the point about diversification. If you've got a new crop choice, you have to have a new set of metrics and measures. It is not a magic wand. It requires the same amount of work as extension farms did in the 40s and 50s when we brought new agriculture. So it's a process that builds trust, that takes time. The difficulty is a lot of these programs want to work in 5 or 10 year cycles, which does not work with how farming and farm systems work. I'll keep quiet, pass it on to Phil.
Phil, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, we need to change all the way up. So consumers need to be more open to different types, but equally the people pushing the options at the consumers in the first place need to be open to more different types as well. So breeders will often, if the goalposts move in the testing system or the evaluation system, they will, it's in their interest to keep producing winners, so they will shift their selection to meet whatever the new goalposts are. But often it's governments that set those goalposts. It's governments or it's the buyers of the crops that set those goalposts. So I think I'm saying that the whole system has to be open to change for the system to be able to change. Otherwise, it'll hit a block somewhere and nothing will change.
Thanks, Phil and Shailaja. I think we're almost coming to an end. So before we end our session, I'd like to ask each of our panelists to give a final statement or message to the audience on the topic that we just discussed. Martin, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about we've talked about, we've all said that wheat has serious advantages, but we've also pointed towards diversity, and I think the good news is we're much more able now scientifically to embark on an unknown crop than we were just a generation ago. And although the last 1500 years has seen a great shrinking down to, as I say, a small number of plants accounting for the most of the food chain, human history has shown a phenomenal diversification of use of many tens of thousands of different plants. And to a great extent, the advantages of our progress is we can now explore diversity in a different way. So although we don't want to put down wheat, it's a plant that serves purpose. We have the option of looking at other crops in a way that we haven't in the past. And the only rider to that, as I say, I think a key question is not how you can make a profit from a plant, but how you can feed the hungry in the world. And that is something I think we need to have in mind. Thank you. Stuff up there.
Thanks, Martin. Alexa or Shailaja, do you want to go next?
Oh, sorry, I thought we were going the same order as last time. Yeah,
oh, yeah, sure. That works.
So if Phil could go, because I was.
Yeah.
What to say that I haven't said already? I feel like I've said an awful lot already. I think yes, I would keep going back to this diversification. So as well as broadening the genetic base of the crops that we're working on, and bringing in new diversity from different sources, including the close relatives. So we do a lot of work with the close relatives of wheat, which often come from extreme climates and bring some really interesting adaptations to some of those stresses. So they'll be really useful for helping to deal with climate change. We need to be open to different ways of growing the crop. So I see there's another question we didn't have time to answer about how can we increase the grain protein and reduce fertilizer? Well, perhaps we could be open to things like intercropping, which used to happen in the past. You put more than one crop in the field, you have a legume that turns atmospheric nitrogen into nitrate in the ground, and then the cereal crop takes up that nitrate. You don't need as much cereal. And you harvest the two crops together and separate them out if you need to, or keep them as a mixture. And these sorts of things are lessons that we learned in the past and forgot about, and we need to be open to remembering those, and not just living in the past of kind of sepia tones and aspic, but combining the lessons we learned from the olden days with the opportunities and the science, the approach that we have now. I think there's a way to bring the two together and really move forwards. And finally, yes, we need to be much more open to a whole range of different food ingredients and food types as we move forward. And now I'm definitely going to stop talking.
Thank you. So I too would like to echo diversity, but both diversity in terms of diverse knowledge systems, recognizing there is still quite a lot of tacit knowledge in how to cultivate, how to store, particularly in the context of climate crisis and logistics of cold chains, any system that allows us to do it with a lower level of either energy use or more cyclical and recyclable systems would be very helpful. So terracotta jars is a far more effective way of cooling water, keeping, sealing it. We've done this with honey, with other fluids. We can think about this across the globe. So one is managing it. And that's really important for the seed security for heritage varieties as well as managing elsewhere. Farmers have to be able to exchange. Farmers are most successful in crop choice by learning by the demonstration effect. They will travel distances to see, they will bring the seeds back, they will invite the other farmer communities. ICRISAT and others do this in a more formal way for new technologies. It can also be done for heritage varieties. And I'd like to add to that the consumption side, and that is the collection of dietary recipes, which include the techniques. And we did that before COVID on the Tigris project. We actually took recordings on phones, our teams did, in terms of how injera is fermented in different parts of Ethiopia. They're different techniques. Now, we couldn't do further testing, but is it because they're in different places? Is it different sorghums? Is it the taste? We need to learn so much more if we have to integrate the food system. So diversity, but on the human side, and diversity in understanding the same crop can have different roles, even in a regional context. Over to you, Alexa.
Thank you so much. I really echo what everyone has said. Again, we've talked about diversity a lot, and I'll say again, diversity is one of the best things that you can do in thinking about your diet. But I also think that bread has been very demonized in the recent couple decades, and it's because we're consuming bad bread. And thinking about how we can consume better bread, and also thinking about how we can make that bread accessible, particularly to everyone in the population. So really good bread, I think, is very expensive still, particularly if you go to your local bakery and you get an artisan loaf that's wholemeal, sourdough fermented. It's going to cost a lot more than what a lot of people can afford, particularly in this cost of living crisis that we're in. And so thinking about policies that would also make these types of bread or novel breads that incorporate different ingredients more accessible to everyone is something that I think we should call on for our governments. And one of the ways is through public procurement policies, thinking about, how can we make this more accessible to everyone? So I think that's where I'll leave it.
Thank you all. Thank you to all of our panelists for today. So just to sum up, we're almost running out of time. So clearly there is something wrong with food, but it is a very complex system. And so partly how we can actually improve our food system is we should consider the diversification of